Hi everyone, welcome to our Athletic Skills podcast. I'm delighted to have Emma O'Toole on with me. Emma is the founder of Built to Endure. Thank you, Emma, for coming on board.
Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here.
Emma, your main passion, well, from knowing you over the last year, is mainly around endurance training. I just want to discuss why your passion is endurance.
So that comes from probably a different approach to maybe many of your listeners, is that I came from an endurance background and then layered strength training, strength conditioning on top of that. So rather than being strength conditioning first and endurance coming later, my passion, my upbringing lent itself more towards the endurance side of things. So competitive in longer distance triathlons from a younger age, and then more into the independent disciplines themselves, so marathons, long course cycling, time trialist, and that side of things. Realized that actually a huge piece of the puzzle was missing, and that was the strength training to support my endurance performance. And unfortunately, in the endurance world, although there has been a shift in recent years, but there's quite a lot of miscommunication about the benefits of strength training for endurance athletes and whether or not it should be something that's being done or not. So it really was to lean into more that actually, why are we going through this cycle of we're training our heavy, we're pushing our bodies, we're being told by our coaching that more, you need to be as light as possible, you need to train as much as possible, when actually there's a far more bang for the buck that we can do to support our overall in athletic development and endurance development as well.
From performing yourself, did you see these trends as you went on, or did you not really notice what the benefits of strength training could do to your performance? As an athlete perspective, what were your thoughts on it?
As an athlete perspective, sort of 10, 15 years ago, it was more don't strength train in that sort of misconception that it's going to make you bulky. And then you need to have a better watts per kilo ratio and better FTP ratio. You need to be light so you can fly up the hills. Similarly, if you're running, you want to be as lean and light as possible so you're not carrying around the excess weight. And there was that real common mantra that was being put out that strength training will make you bulky and it will really have that hypertrophic effect, which, as we know as strength and conditioning coaches, and I'm sure even Gen Pop bodybuilders out there, it's actually really hard to gain muscle, and just going in and doing the training is only one piece of the puzzle, let alone once you put on top 8 hours, 10 hours plus of endurance training in there as well. So definitely from an athlete point of view, it was more, it wasn't almost, it just wasn't really talked about. It wasn't something that it was discussed. It's wild really when you think about other sports and you think of more field sports and more contact sports, and the strength and conditioning side of it is so linked, they're so adjoined. You wouldn't imagine a footballer and also not doing strength training. If you watch a documentary, you often get shown clips of them in the gym and that side of their training, as well as on the field side, all of those drills are being taken out onto the field. But actually, in the endurance space, it was never something that's really discussed. However, that information was out there. It's just trickled its way down. I often reference a YouTube video of Mo Farah from I think it was from the 2012 Olympics, and he was going through his strength training program, and obviously a fantastic long distance endurance athlete, gold medalist. So yeah, that information was out there, but it's 2024, so 12 years on, it's starting to trickle down into the recreational athlete. And
Go on.
And also from my own personal experience as well. So I had lots of injuries over the years, and seeing many friends go through similar injuries, and we're all sort of riding those highs and those lows. So you get to the point where, yeah, I'm good to go, I've got this race, and then 3 weeks out, you're unable to partake in it because of an injury we say they're more overuse injuries, especially in endurance sports like running, where there's not really that risk of contact or impact, unless obviously you were to trip and fall. Obviously, trail running, you've got a bit more exposure with the uneven terrain and rolling ankles and such, but it's really hard. It's really hard going to see your friends and see those who you're competitive against, but also you want to see succeed and ride those waves with them. And it caused loads of people to stay away from the sport. And often in the endurance world, you hear so many cyclists say, I'm a cyclist, I used to be a runner, but I've got such bad knees, or my knees hurt when I run and I can't do it. Although I love to do it, I can't do it anymore. And that's a real shame, because actually there's probably some interventions, or there could have been some interventions in the past to have changed.
Was that when your mindset changed as well? Was that an injury that you got that then your mindset changed in terms of what strength training could give you? And then that's now taking you forward in terms of your passion to show others?
Definitely, absolutely. So I think I couldn't necessarily say I pinpoint it to one specific injury that's it, because I think over the years there's been a host of, some from impact, so crashing on the bike, others from overuse injuries. And it was more of that cumulative effect of like, right, something has to change. I can't go through that. I'm healthy for a year and then I'm injured, or I've done great in this race for myself. I'm really happy with that performance. It's taking me places, but then I feel like I was just liken it to you're climbing up a mountain, you see the summit, and then you just end up rolling back to the bottom. However, obviously with strength training, we can't predict that it's not a golden ticket that you're never going to get injured. And even from my own experience of including strength training, if something else falls by the wayside, say nutrition, for instance, that can still lead to overuse injuries, stress fractures, because yes, you've got the best training plan, it's progressive, it's periodized, you've got deload weeks in there, you've got a great strength and conditioning plan, you're sleeping 8 to 10 hours a night, but that other key pillar is missing. So that's often something as well that needs to be communicated, that strength training is not going to be this bulletproof suit that you just wrap yourself up with and it gives you a free pass to miss out on the other important aspects or pillars of athleticism, not just for endurance sports as well.
And we'll get into more later around what actually goes on in terms of strength training, how that can benefit your endurance training. And we'll also chat a little bit about built endurance, why you built that. But it's interesting you mentioned around the misconceptions in the endurance world of strength training, because I see on the flip side in the S&C world how a lot of coaches will know a lot about strength, but they'll not know a lot about the conditioning side, whether that's through their studies or just their passion is more around working in the gym and then not knowing as much around the conditioning side. And same with sports coaches as well, how the misconception around what conditioning or endurance training could be about. So we could chat about a lot about endurance training, I imagine, and you could go into detail, but can you just explain the benefits of having a good endurance base for any athlete and then different ways you can maybe look to develop that as a general overview?
So endurance training is an enabler for athletes in any sport, really. Obviously 100% in endurance sports, but also in field sports. So in football, I think a lot of the time, sometimes people think, oh, it's quite stop-start, as in, obviously, if the ball's there, then it's not necessarily just when the ball's there, because obviously you're going to be following the game and moving up and down the pitch, but there's going to be, it's always interval-based in the sense that there's periods of time where you're active, and then there's other periods of time when you're resting. So if the play's at the opposite end of the pitch, then you're not necessarily going to be running or doing a maximum sprint effort. But actually, quite a lot of the limitations that actually we see in endurance sports are also present in field sports for the endurance side of things. Often a 5K specialist, their limiter is their endurance. So that athlete potentially needs to have a higher running volume, not done at 5K pace, not done at maximum intensity or 5K intensity and beyond, but actually done at that lower intensity. So they're building their endurance. So they're building their aerobic capacity to then be able to layer that speed on. So if I was thinking of a field sport, a rugby player who is going down the line, and actually potentially that last 10 seconds of that last 4 seconds of their sprint, that they suddenly completely fade, then rather than just getting them, really hammering them with conditioning of, we need to do 100-meter sprints, you've got to do 200-meter sprints and drill work. But actually that athlete probably needs a better endurance base. They need a better aerobic capacity in order to enable them to have that higher level of sprint or top end performance. And that is something which is often overlooked. And again, that's often overlooked in the endurance community as well. And that, or I want to run 5K, I just need to run 5K, when actually there's a huge benefit of over distance runs for a 5K athlete where their endurance or their aerobic capacity is their limiter. And I do think,
go on.
and I do think that's something in the S&C world, that conditioning is probably predominantly thought of short work. So short periods of time, it might be tempo work, it might be threshold or maximum effort. level of endurance work, whereas actually there's a big space to improve those elements, but by increasing the aerobic capacity of the individual.
Yeah, and I like to use the reference to athletes who often ask me why you do endurance training or why we're doing these longer runs. It's help you benefit in terms of repeating your high intensity actions. So can you do the same sprint in the first minute as in the 90th minute, or can you still ball at 80 miles an hour in the first over, or when you're doing it at 8 hours later at the end of the day? So that endurance training will really help you in terms of recovering quicker as well and coming back and repeating those high intensity
Mm.
actions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's obviously worth, as with anything, even with the strength side of things, but the conditioning side as well, as considering that individual in front of you. So we don't just take a cookie cutter approach and then apply it to all athletes, but looking at, okay, where's the athlete now? What's their training experience? What's their injury history? What's their goals? What's their position on the pitch? What do they need more of? What do they need less of? And harnessing your conditioning to support them in that regard.
So I think a lot of coaches might think endurance training is either running your athletes into the ground or doing a lot of shuttles, or I know a lot of athletes thought it was just going on a long run, needs to go run on a 5-10K run, and that's the class of their endurance training. But I'm sure it's a lot more than that in terms of when you can get into different methods of developing your endurance.
Yeah, certainly. So there's a whole host of different approaches out there, and obviously quite popular at the moment is the more of the polarized approach between that low intensity, high intensity, and there's different splits touted around, with 80-20 probably being the most common. I'm sure there's people listening that have heard the 80-20 principle. And also it's worth remembering that sort of regardless of that split, because that split again is going to depend on the athlete in front of you, their goals, their injury history, their experience. Worth considering is the fact that running is just one method of endurance training. So it doesn't have to be running. Obviously, yes, sports specific for many field sports, there will be the element of running. But if you're dealing with an athlete who's got a lot of injury history and they reach a certain run volume, but really you want them to go beyond that to help develop their aerobic capacity, but then they break down, they start to get more, they start to open themselves up to injury, then why not implement a different method? So cycling is a fantastic alternative where you can really elicit a similar sort of training response in terms of the cardiovascular response and the training stimulus you're giving that athlete, but you're not putting that body weight and that impact through that load through the body for that athlete. Similarly, swimming, another good alternative, but even just for a lower end endurance, so this is often something quite heavily used for the ultra marathons or ultra distance events. It would be varying terrain. So go and ruck or go and hike across different sort of terrains like the South Downs Way in the UK or the Jurassic Coast or around the Lake Districts, obviously depending on where you are geographically. But go out there, keep it steady 3-4 hours with a rucksack on your back and obviously nutrition fuel along the way. But I do think sometimes it can be seen that actually, oh, I've just got to run, as if you said, of do drills or run yourself into the ground. But there'd be a lot of benefits that could be gained just from taking a different approach, a different methodology towards endurance training and seeing it as more than running. And that, again, is going to keep it fun and fresh for your athletes, because if they don't particularly enjoy running, the whole point of S&C is that it's there, or for me, in an endurance background, the S&C there is to support the goal, which is often running, cycling. I want to run a marathon in this time. I want to ride a time trial in this time, for instance. As the same, I'm sure, for many field sports is, I want to be better at this, or I want to be more effective in this position on the pitch. So the S&C is always there to support the aim goal. So why would we make it something that our athletes dread or really hate doing? Of course, there's going to be times where we have to, okay, we want to make it a bit more specific. We want to make it, we just shy away from not doing things that we don't particularly enjoy. But there are certainly a hell of a lot of other methods out there of endurance training other than just running, which many athletes will love.
And when I was working in cricket as an S&C coach, I remember using a lot of cycling or spinning sessions, the watt bike, and that was great fun. The athletes had really good competition with that. And also we did quite a few boxing sessions or boxercise sessions, and that was really different in terms of an hour would fly by and the heart rates would be high. and they would burn and they would do just as much as they might do in a running session, but without actually realizing it. So different forms of endurance training other than running, and like you say, keeping that fun as well.
And touching upon what you said, the indoor cycling world in particular has come on leaps and bounds, even in more. So if it was a team base and you took them into sort of a commercial gym setting, then there's often platforms and software now where you can have everyone's name up on the screen linked to their own personal bike. And I'm sure you may have used, but you can make it more competitive and make it more engaging and more of that team-based. Okay, just as you would as a competitive, you're getting people to do 100-meter sprints out there, and who wants to come first, second, third, or whatever. But you can really challenge people against each other, but also they can challenge themselves. There's certain sort of models now which link to different colors. So the colors of intensity, depending on your power output. And then obviously the athletes then got a visual representation of where they are, where they're working, and they can see their progress with it as well.
Can you just go back to, you mentioned around the 80-20 split? And so for anyone that may be unsure what that might be, could you just explain a little bit in terms of, is that the split in terms of what you do in your training? Yeah, just explain a little bit more around that.
So the 80-20 split is a endurance split. So talking about your running, cycling, training volume, or your cross training volume, in which it's quite a polarized approach. So you're taking 80% of your training at a low, maybe touching upon moderate volume, but predominantly a low volume, low intensity. And the other 20% is done at that higher intensity. So in the week, for instance, say an athlete's training 6 times in the week, that could look something like 2 steady runs. I know they're often called easy runs, but we won't go into the sort of terminology and my issues with the word easy, but 2 sort of steady runs, 2 more intense runs, so that 20%, and then there could potentially be 1 run. Well, let's think about that. If we think about that 80-20 split in the week, we could have an athlete's training 6 times a week. They could have 2 steady runs, 1 long run, for instance, and then 2 higher intensity runs in there. But it's more just around, you don't want your athlete always going out to the point that they feel like they're nailing themselves. But equally, we don't want 100% of it just to be low intensity, because obviously we need those different training stimuluses to elicit different responses. And I like the 80-20 split because I think it's quite clear for people to understand. But I think what's important is if somebody is training for an event or start of the season, that actually we need that more of a periodized approach. And I often liken it to hobs on a cooker, that we've got them all running and then we just turn up the heat a little bit more. So someone approaching their marathon date, for instance, and they want to run at a certain time, sort of 6 weeks out, 4 to 6 weeks out, will then start to turn up the heat a little bit more on some marathon pace work so that they know what that it actually feels like to run at the pace that they're targeting for that marathon, rather than suddenly think that, oh, I've done a 20-mile long run, which has involved no marathon pace work, and it's been a minute or 90 seconds slower than what they actually want to run that marathon for. Yeah, it's a good split in the sense of keeping people not going either all out or not anything at all, but there's just nuances in that.
I just want to touch on one form of, or one type of training in terms that it can be done in any method, but around interval training. So I'm sure a lot of coaches have heard of either long intervals or short intervals, and the split between in terms of the work to rest ratio and how intensity working at. So could you explain the benefits of doing interval training in comparison to maybe continuous training, and how you might start to program your intervals as well in terms of what outcome you want to develop?
So I would program these into that 20% split or the higher intensity split for the athletes. So one thing before I think of any programming would be to be mindful of the athlete starting point. So if you've got an athlete coming to you and you're suddenly throwing loads of new variables at them, you're going to say, I want you to do, 20-second all out maximum sprints with a 2-minute recovery in between, and then, or 10-second maximum sprints with a recovery in between, a long recovery in between, and then more of a 1-to-1 ratio, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, for instance, at a lower intensity. then you also want them to increase their volume of just aerobic training in general. You're suddenly throwing 3 new things at that athlete, which their body's going to have to respond to. So I think it can be quite illustrious to be like, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to have short intervals, we need to have long intervals, which can work definitely, but it's, again, comes down to the individual and what's right for them, depending on where they are and their experience, their training age, etc. So I normally use paces, so it lines quite nicely for most of the people I work with, in the sense of, what's your 5K pace? We're going to do shorter intervals at 5K and beyond pace. So it could be a 400-meter sprint, for instance, at 5K pace. And then we could do more threshold intervals at a 10K pace, more tempo intervals at a half marathon pace. But obviously conscious that a lot of that might not necessarily correspond to a lot of the S&C coaches listening to this, because their athletes may not have that knowledge or that experience of, that's my half marathon pace, or that's my marathon pace and my 5K pace, for instance. So there are calculators out there which you can estimate those from, but a great way of doing it would be heart rate training and or just simple rate of perceived exertion. So you're keeping that ceiling low for the athlete, in the sense of, you don't need loads of equipment, but we can just work off of effort level, and it will be that, that shorter interval, we're looking for a 9 out of 10 effort, and then the longer form, we might be looking for a 7 or an 8, depending obviously on how long that interval is. And then, as you touched upon earlier, it's the repeatability of that. So if you're setting someone to do 6 800-meter sprints or 6 800-meter runs back to back with recovery in between, so 2 minutes recovery in between, for instance, then if they get to the fourth one and they're completely faded, would you get that athlete to carry on and do the extra 2? I wouldn't, I would say, because it's that risk reward, but also, what are they asking that question? What is that athlete getting at the end of that? Because they're not really getting anything from just trying to hammer themselves to hit a target that they're not going to hit because they faded way too early. So then that's just a chance for you to reflect back and be like, okay, look at the bigger picture. What was the athlete's nutrition like in the day? What was their hydration like, their sleep, stress? But then also, did they hit the session potentially a bit early? How have we progressed up to that point? How did I keep them in check during those 800-meter intervals, for instance?
And you mentioned a little bit there around how you program interval training, and I can see that method's really, personally, when I my coaching, that was really good in making sessions individualized, especially when you're working with a big team and you've got maybe a lot of athletes working at the same time. Using interval training is a great way to make it individualized, because you might use certain distances that an athlete has to run, and you can group them into those distances from maybe your profiling, or maybe their rate of perceived exertion, in terms of they can maybe move up and down a group if they wanted to. So interval training is a great way to manage a certain team in terms of individualized. Whereas if you go and tell a group of athletes to run a 5 or 10K, there's going to be variability there in terms of the effort they're going to put in, the times they're going to get out of that, and how hard they're working through that. So interval training, I think, is a great way to make things individualized.
Absolutely. And then you can work to the group of athlete, the cohort that you've got in front of you. And if, as you said, there's quite a range of variability between how long it takes somebody to run 400 meters, if they can do it in a minute to 90 seconds, or if it takes somebody double that time, for instance, then you then have to think, okay, I'm not going to expect the athlete who it takes 3 minutes to run 400 meters to do that 6 times, because actually their exposure at that level is going to be way more than the athlete who can run 400 meters in a minute to 90 seconds. So it's just being mindful of that, and leaning into time-based. So if you want your athlete to target a certain intensity level, then distance may not always be the right thing for them, because actually it's not going to be plausible. Nobody can run a 10 out of 10 effort for 8 minutes, because it's then thinking, okay, how can I manage that for the athletes that I'm working with? And yet distances can be great, but I would say as well that time is also another nice way of managing it. And sometimes, to keep it more fun, if it was in a group setting, I would do probably more for the longer course intervals, but you're going to run at this target intensity or this target heart rate if they've got the monitor on, and we're going to keep it, or run at this pace individualized for each person, and you're going to go for the music stops. And then they don't know how long it's going to be. It could be 5 minutes, 30. And then you can throw in other things like, okay, when you hear this word or when you hear this part of the chorus, I want you to accelerate for 10 seconds, something like that. And then obviously you're monitoring it as well. So can be quite a fun way, I think, rather than it be, if you say run 800 meters, they know it's 2 laps of the track. So if you use time, it can be a bit more, oh yeah. Plus they feel a bit more in control because they can do music choices rather than letting
That's
it
a
be
big one, yeah.
cheesy pop or something like that. Or some be conducive to a high intensity work.
Yeah, I was touching to your mindset really as an athlete and what endurance athletes may be like. So I think from a team sport athlete perspective, endurance training can be a little bit boring for athletes in terms of longer runs. So first I want to touch on how you manage to keep yourself engaged when you're maybe training for an ultra marathon or people that you work with training for Ironmans, which you can be working for a long period of time. So how do you keep those athletes engaged or keep the training fun? Because it's a different way to how maybe team sport athletes look to train.
Yeah, I'd say probably the one thing that underpins it all is your coach athlete relationship, and in that helping them understand the why. Because if you just give them, I want you to do this, and I want you to go Ironman athlete, I want you to go and ride for 6 hours on a Sunday, it's your whole weekend on that day gone, because the Saturday you'll be training as well, likely. They're going to be a lot more open to that idea if they're on board with the reasons why. So what is that particular ride doing for my training or for the overall goal of making me an Ironman or towards that Ironman effort? So I definitely think having your athletes understand why, and it hasn't got to be every session you've done a breakdown of this is going to give you this sort of training adaptation, but it's just that general picture of we're here, we're in our build phase, this is what we're doing, this is what the target is. Next month or 6 weeks down the line, we're going to move up to this phase so they can see that journey as well. And then I find that definitely helps with engagement and just the consistency of training, because they're like, okay, yeah, I've got it. Similarly, I'm sure if you said to, or if listeners said to their athletes, like, we are going to run a 5K, but we're not going to go all out. We're going to keep it nice and steady. And we're going to do that so that you can improve your fatigue resistance on the pitch so that come the end of the 90 minutes, you're not as flatlined or faded, or you don't feel like, oh my gosh, my legs are knackered and I can't walk for 3 days after the match. Then they'd probably be a lot more on board with doing that. And then in terms of the practical, keeping it fun, I'd suppose leaning into community. So endurance sports typically are quite lonely in the sense of, as you said, if you're doing even the top marathon runners that I work with, we'll be looking at 70 miles plus a week. And yes, of course, it's relative to the pace it takes to run a mile, but upwards of 70 miles a week, that's still a lot of time, 10 hours out there on your own. Often first thing in the morning when it's dark or cold, it can be quite a lonely thing to do. So I find sort of the power of community in the sense of, are there any local clubs that you could join? So obviously park runs are pretty much common now at most places on a Saturday, but then other running clubs, online communities where people can just share what they've done. Also I can't remember, but there's, I think it might be the Long Run Show, which was set up by Chris Ford. They do satellite communities where they'll set a run and then people follow those runs on like a Monday, Wednesday or Friday. And then they set in-person satellite groups as well where runners can all get together, which I think is quite a nice way. And then in terms of cycling, we touched upon a little bit about the platforms, but there's a whole host of online platforms now where you can have chats with people. They've gamified it as well. But I do think, the community side of it, as much as you can I guess it's a virtual community. It's not necessarily a face-to-face one. And then if you do just like being out there on your own, that's absolutely fine as well. And it's just finding what works for you. I find for me on longer runs or I don't actually listen to music out on a ride for safety purposes, but definitely when I run, I do. And I normally start off with a bit of music and then it'll go into an audiobook or a podcast. So it's quite a nice way. I find it just switches off and I just keep quite methodical of ticking away at a steady pace. But again, you can change that and be like, I've got an interval session, so I'm going to want some more higher intensity music coming in. I know one runner of mine, triathlete of mine, Sarah, and she's got playlists that I'm going to run this 5K in this time. And she knows the song that ends, that at the end of what should be the 5K. I said to her, she's very dedicated to that cause, but that's another quite a fun way of doing it, in the sense of, okay, I must only have a mile to go because I'm at this part of the playlist or in this song. So there's quite a few options in there.
Oh, you mentioned around the playlist there, and I had one athlete, I remember that when they were working on their endurance, and we did a 2 kilometers time trial quite often as their measure of endurance. And each time they said they wanted to progress, they wanted to knock off a song of their playlist each time. So take out a song until they finish on the previous song, and then so on and so on. So that was quite a cool way for them to individualize in terms of focusing as well in something they might not enjoy doing, but they're
What?
relating to maybe a goal as well. And you mentioned there around the commutes are so important when you're working, and I guess that's where the gym will then come in terms of strength training, because you could then go to the gym, work on different things, and speak to other people as well. So we'll now touch on your passion around the strength training and what that might offer in
Yeah.
terms of the endurance side. Why is strength training important for an endurance aspect, would you say?
So to me, I often uphold the principle that strength training is your endurance enabler. So if that's running, that's cycling, that's triathlon, it's your endurance enabler. So strength training is what is going to allow you to be the top performer or be the highest achieving athlete that you can be, because it's going to stimulate your body and challenge your body weight in different ways that it's not getting through endurance training alone. So obviously, like I said, if you're clocking up 8, 10, even 6 hours plus of endurance training in the week, then your body is already well versed to that low intensity, or could be high intensity, but it's well versed to dealing with that effort level, in the sense of a cyclist doing 90 RPM for 60 minutes is clocking up thousands of revolutions of the pedals at a certain torque or putting out a certain power output. Similarly, the runner at 170 strides per minute for 30 minutes is clocking up thousands of strides per minute. So our bodies are used to that. So we need that different training stimulus. And unfortunately, we often see it that in my side of things, that people just want to run more. They just want to do the endurance side of things more, and they neglect that strength work. And it can be okay. They might get away with it. They might get through a couple of races, but then it does bite them, and it might bite them, 10 years down the line, where they're now a masters athlete. And they're like, oh gosh, I'm dealing with that problem, or I'm dealing with this problem. I never used to have this. And it's because we're not respecting that principle that strength training is your endurance enabler. It's not supposed to come in and just take you away from your endurance training, but it's there to support it and to enhance it. So I think that's why I have that principle, because sometimes with strength training, people think, oh, but I should be running, or I should be doing the endurance work. That's the priority. That's the sport. That's the specific training I need to do. Where it's looking at the bigger picture of your training and being like, well, actually, let's look at what you're already doing. Let's look at the journey you've been on so far, the sort of common recurring trends that we're seeing. And it might actually be more beneficial that we drop that 40-minute recovery ride or steady ride, zone 2 ride, and instead do a 40-minute strength session, because that's going to give you far more bang for your buck and challenge your body in a completely different way than doing that 40-minute ride that you've already got a plethora of endurance training through the week already. And it's just a bit more junk volume is the term that's often thrown around, that it's just you're doing it for the sake of doing it.
And I think a lot of the strategies will apply across all sports and types of training here. But you mentioned you've had a little bit of pushback in terms of athletes or people's perceptions on strength training. So what strategies do you use in terms of getting people's buy-in for strength, in terms of how strength training could apply to their endurance training, and that could then apply to other aspects in terms of team sport athletes, and maybe show why strength training could apply to their actual skills. So yeah, what sort of strategies do you use in that way?
I think it's people aware, and even there's almost two categories that people can fall into. There's the category that they've unfortunately reached a point that they're injured or they're getting recurrent injuries and it's something needs to change. And then there's the category of, oh, I'm hearing quite a lot about this. I almost want to beat the curve. I want to get ahead before it bites me, so to speak. So there's the two categories of people there, but ultimately it's that problem awareness of, are you even aware of these problems associated with just doing high levels of endurance training or high volume of endurance training and not the strength training to support it. And thinking, okay, how can I make these people problem aware? And then how can I make them also solution aware that it hasn't got to be, as we said, we're talking two strength sessions, predominantly 2 to 3, maybe 3 in the off season, but 2 strength sessions periodized throughout the year to support your endurance performance. It's that the buy-in is almost comes through that problem and solution awareness, but then it's a bit of a no-brainer is then, oh yeah, why would I not dedicate 90 minutes of my time or 2 45-minute sessions, for instance, when I'm going to get such a good return on that? And then I suppose because it is now becoming more and more talked about, seeing other people's successes. And I think there's a big thing, which I think is also in the S&C world in general, is that a lot of people think, oh, the condition, or you need an S&C coach if you're a professional, or if you're really high level, or if you're an age group, or if you wear the skin suit of your country. Whereas actually, everyone can benefit from strength and conditioning training, and even just down to the beginner runner, for instance, or the beginner footballer, or somebody getting back into football. A lot of the time with running, we see, and running and running and injuries, is that their strides per minute is really low. So their running cadence is really low, and that's obviously causing load through the body, potential overstriding, etc. But actually, we could then, if that person was introduced to plyometrics, for instance, that side of the conditioning, low-level plyometrics, pogo jumps, single-leg pogo jumps, obviously depending on where they are, but then that can start to get their neuromuscular systems higher, and that can then improve their cadence. And it shouldn't be reserved just for the top-end athlete or the person really high up there chasing scholarships or chasing certain times and performances, but actually there is so much gain and benefit for the everyday athlete as well, the recreational athlete. But I think that's probably another battle, in the sense of you've then got to help change that athlete's mindset, and that they don't even view themselves as an athlete in the first instance. So then why would they then prioritize S&C? So it's a tough one. And even, I think I struggle with it in my community quite a lot. Of people are like, oh, I just do it for fun and I'm just recreational, I do it. But I do want to get this performance, and that's great. But part of that is going to change when you start to picture yourself as the athlete and believe in yourself as the athlete, because that's when you're going to become more on board that, okay, even if you divided your strength up into 20-minute sessions 3-4 times a week, you're going to do those sessions because in the bigger picture, that's going to contribute to where you want to be and where you want to get to. And also, I'd say looking at the longevity of it. So I think, I'm sure I've been guilty of it in the past as well, but we can almost get blindsided into that short-term thinking of, where am I now? Where do I want to get to? Where's the next race? When's the next goal? Whereas actually thinking, what sort of endurance athlete or what sort of footballer do I want to be in 15 years' time? Do I still want to be playing? No. Okay. But what do I want to be doing though? Do I want to be able to run around in the garden with my grandkids or wherever that person is? And thinking that strength training is actually for life. It's your endurance enabler, but it's also your longevity with your own health, fitness and well-being.
And you can picture then that, as you've all referenced that, to the long-term athletic development model, where you start with active start and you go through learn to train, train to performance and so on. But then that last stage is active for life. So that could extend from when someone ever finishes their academy or maybe before, or their sport, and they want to be active for life. And that might be that during strength and conditioning training, it's just to be for general health, like you mentioned, running around in the garden, or just general activity around the life, or just being able to move around without any issues. And like you said, it's how we perceive what strength and conditioning is, but that could be another podcast we could chat around, I guess. So
definitely, yes, absolutely. Because even in just general sarcopenia as we age, it's out there and it affects everyone. But it's almost, if we can get ahead of the curve and just make it integral from a young age, when we're already doing something and we've maybe got a different focus, that, okay, I am strength training to support my performance on the pitch. But actually, if we can build those habits and build that muscle quality, build that movement quality, build that technique from a young age or from whenever we start training, then that's only going to pay dividends later on down the line when we do continue to continue strength training or pick it back up again to help with things like fall prevention and osteoporosis and that side of things. Yeah, it's definitely the longevity part is often overlooked.
And the last topic I want to chat around, which ties in nicely to strength training, you just mentioned there, was the importance of movement competency and actually moving well within the gym. So whether that was going through your squatting pattern or your hinging pattern or even your running technique. So where does movement competency training fit in within your programming, and why is that important in terms of an endurance athlete?
So I would say it's always there. And again, it's a bit like that gas hob or cooker analogy where we may turn up the heat at certain points or depending on where that person is in their season. So you're sort of following the periodization, looking at the goal for that athlete or where late of their season is. And I would say that the movement competency and that movement mastery is always going to be there, and we can challenge it in different ways. That could be through load, that could be through tempos, that could be through ranges of motion. But ultimately, it's looking at what can that athlete do right now. And rather than thinking that in order to progress, oh, they must put more weight on the bar or they must lift up a heavier kettlebell. It's, hold on a minute. There's so many different ways that we can challenge this athlete in order to then, yes, we may get to that point, but at the moment, they're not there. They're not ready for that point because we need to improve the movement mastery. And you may be surprised. I've been surprised. It looks like an athlete's completely got something nailed and you're like, okay, yeah, you've really got that hinge pattern. For instance, the single leg deadlift, and you've moved away from maybe holding on to a fixed object for support, and now you've gone for an unsupported version. And then you put that into a B stance where you think, oh, actually, there is more support from now that rear foot being on the floor, but that can completely throw an athlete because it's still a hinge pattern, but it's different, obviously, but it's targeting sort of different musculature or more bias, I'd say, in different ways on different muscle groups, but that can completely throw certain athletes. So that's where I think that thinking that movement mastery is continued and it's always evolving. And I think that's true in what we do as strength coaches is you wouldn't get a beginner in and suddenly start chucking Olympic lifts at them if they've never done any strength training in the past before, because it's a recipe for injury and probably for them to walk away and be like, what on earth did I just do, and not get anything out of it. And I think a lot of people, athletes, coaches, should take that step back and be like, what can we do with body weight right now? And that's the initial phase. And it doesn't have to be that you stay there for months on end. I don't recommend that either. But if somebody can't squat and their chest is collapsing forwards or their heels are coming up off the ground, why would you go and stick a barbell on their back in that incident? You'd have to think, okay, I often try and reference things back to endurance training, but if somebody can't run 5K, why would I sign them up for a marathon? They're not going to be able to do it, are they? It's just silly. It's just going to be despondent. It's going to probably ruin their relationship with running in that incident. Yeah, I'd say it's a continual development.
And that's a general message I like to share in terms of fundamental movements. Should be key for all aspects in terms of each athlete's development. And as you maybe progress in terms of an exercise or a drill, then still looking at how they move is key in terms of your coaching aspect as well. So yeah, that's nice to show that message still transfers into the endurance world as well. Just to finish off, do you want to explain a little bit more around Built to Endure? What's going on with that aspect? And just a little bit more about Built to Endure, really.
Yep. So that Built to Endure basically came out of notice a real gap in the market in the sense of, I think as we were saying before this call, that there's a lot of strength certifications out there which really focus on the strength side of things, but don't necessarily focus on the conditioning side of things. And for me, it's almost the reverse of that. I work with a lot of athletes or even other coaches, a lot of running coaches, cycling coaches they're fantastic. They're amazing at the conditioning side of things for their athletes, but they've got no real understanding of the strength side of things. And it's more of that hybrid approach or that closed approach to bring the two together to be like, strength training for endurance purpose is different. What I prescribe to my athletes is going to be different to what you prescribe to your athletes, because my athlete's running 70 miles a week and that's going to be a hell of a lot of fatigue that they're carrying around. So we need something that helps that and measures that and is for those athletes, rather than, as I said, taking that cookie cutter approach and oh, that works for rugby players. Okay, that's fine. Or I'm going to do 5 days a week in the gym and it's going to be more of a bodybuilder split or something like that. And it all comes down to the needs analysis at the end of the day, and obviously the athlete analysis as well, the individual analysis. But that's something that we didn't really have. So Built to Endure is to plug that gap, really, in the sense of strength and conditioning for endurance purposes. Because yes, I know even in my previous experience, just somebody said, go in and do this or back squat. Hold on a minute, my legs are absolutely fried from the training beforehand, and we're now being governed by my 1RM, which there's an argument if you should even be doing that as an endurance athlete or not anyway. But why am I being governed by a percentage of my 1RM or my 3RM when that was set completely different time to where I am now, where I set that 3RM or 1RM when I had 20 miles in my legs, for instance, and now I've got 50. That's going to naturally affect my ability to perform in the gym and in that strength setting. Yeah, there's an argument around that.
And like you said, there is a bit of a gap there in terms of knowledge of the endurance side. So if anyone's got any questions around endurance training or wants to know a little bit about Built to Endure or anything that we spoke around today, is there any ways people can get in touch with you or see what's going on with Built to Endure?
Built to Endure's got a website, www.builttoendure.pro, and there's a contact me or get in touch link on there, or also LinkedIn. I'm quite visible on LinkedIn as well.
That's great, and I'll put those in the show notes for anyone that wants to watch. So Emma, thank you very much for coming to join us, and it's been great to chat around a different topic that we haven't really spoken around too much around endurance training, and we can definitely see a passion around wanting to change the ways and how people's mindset is in this area. So thank you very much for chatting.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Emma.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Brendan Chaplin Business Coaching. Brendan guides coaches and service-based entrepreneurs to deliver their best work, build a 7-figure lifestyle and performance business, and create a life of freedom. I started working with Brendan in September 2023, and it's been a great journey since I started working with him in launching my own business, Athletic Skills. Brendan has been fully invested in me and is a great person to chat with, to share ideas, and has vast knowledge and experiences to share also. The reason I picked to work with Brendan is that he has done it himself in launching businesses and has a similar background to myself in S&C and wants to live a life that you want. If you want to speak to Brendan on how he can help create a life of freedom and guide you on that journey, get in touch with him by one of the methods in the show notes and DM him the word coach, and he will start the conversation. You won't regret it, and there's a good chance it might just change your life too. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Athletic Skills Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it helpful in learning more about impacting your youth athletes' movement and physical development. If you did enjoy this episode, please take a moment to give us a subscribe and share to any other coaches or teachers that you think it may help. Also, if you have any feedback or topics that you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or on the email in the description, and we'll be more than happy to try and tackle those challenges you are facing as a sports coach or a PE teacher. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. I look forward to speaking to you soon.